All right. Well, we've been talking all this week about fighting the fight of faith, and this idea that it's about leaving behind the doing or having paradigm, right? And running towards pursuing being a different kind of person. And the way that that being takes place, okay, is very specific. The method for how we become is very specific. It's through faith. It's through coming back to the truths of God's Word. That's our responsibility. Come back to the truths of God's Word, stand on those truths, okay? And that will cause us to become a different kind of person, okay? It's really important to keep that distinction because sometimes it can very easily become chasing after being, right? Instead of running to the truths of God's Word, right? But it is God who's going to produce that in us. In other words, there's a method for getting there, and the method is to fight the fight of faith. That's the idea, okay? If we begin to go do something else, we begin to teach legalism. So now in the last couple of weeks, or last couple of nights, we talked about Daniel and Esther. And Daniel gave us an example of someone who fought the fight of faith. You can say, okay, let's look at Daniel's life, and you can see specific truths that Daniel believed, right, as he walked with the Lord. As you look at Esther's life, you don't see that. You see that there are truths that she would have known, right, but then she doesn't live those out, okay? And so the idea is that one gives us this example of what it looks like to fight the fight of faith, right? And the other one, there's sort of neutrality, right? Sort of passivity, okay? Not intentionality, no intentionality, all right? Now tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look and say, okay, so let's look at this conceptually one more time and just see if we can help pull some things together. I'd just like to start with Matthew 13:44. And it's a simple verse that you'll be familiar with, so I'll just read it here. It says, "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field." Right? Is that intelligent? Is that smart? So he goes, he finds a field, there's a treasure in the field. So he's like, okay, let me hide the treasure, hides the treasure, right? Goes back over, sells everything he has in order to buy the field. Smart? Intelligent? What do you think? That's really the issue. It depends on the value, right? It would not be smart if you got over there and the treasure wasn't there. But assuming that the treasure is there and it's worth more than what you got, then of course, it's a mathematical thing, right? I mean, it just comes down to values. If everything that you own is worth $100,000 and the treasure in the field is worth $200,000, well then of course you sell it and you go and buy that. And that's kind of the assumption, right? But what does it feel like to do that? So let's assume that it is a smart move. Let's assume that this is a positive thing to sell this and to go over here and grab this, okay? What does it feel like to do that in real life? Risky. It would feel risky. Okay, what else might it feel like? What would it be like to do that? What'd you say? Scary. I think it would be a little scary. What'd you say?
It's unlearned. I mean, you found the treasure. Whose treasure was it before?
Okay, all right, yeah, okay.
Exciting.
Yeah. What's that?
Exciting.
Exciting. I think it could be exciting too, right? There's sort of that surge of adrenaline, and you're on the hunt. You know, you're on the chase. You got a plan, right? You know, I think one of the things that I think it's easy to say is that while this is a mathematical thing, you know, I'm going to sell what I have, which is $100,000, and I'm going to get what this thing over here, which is $200,000. The thing is that the $100,000 is actually worth more to me than the $100,000, because the truth is that there's more value to what you have than the actual value that you can sell it for, right? I mean, there's sort of a sense there. And my grandparents are actually still alive. My grandfather is the architect for what you see here. He was an architect all through his life. He's 94 now, but he still draws these buildings for me. I say, Grandpa, I need a building. Can you draw this up for me? You know, and he will, and he'll draw up this thing. So he's 94, but what this means is that since they've lived in the same house, basically since my parents were, you know, young, my dad was raised in that house. My grandpa, when they were younger, he began to put their heights on the wall. He went down the basement, and there behind the boiler, he began to mark the kids' heights on the wall. And so my dad and his brother and their sister, they grew up putting their heights on the wall in the basement, right? But then there was another generation, the next generation. That was my generation. We came along, and all three of those siblings had children, right? And so then we would go down in the basement, you know, and eventually there's not a boiler anymore. Now there's an HVAC system and all that kind of stuff. But we would get our heights on the wall. And it was such a cool thing because you'd look over and you'd say, hey, Dad, I'm taller than you, and I was, when you were 8, but it began to spread along the wall. But now there's a third generation, another generation, because my kids, my oldest are 19, right? So all of those cousins began to have kids, and that whole generation has now risen up. None of them have kids yet, okay? But there's a whole nother generation. So now this wall is probably, I would guess, is somewhere between 6 and 8 feet, right, with these lines all over it everywhere. And everybody goes down there, when they go down to work on it, like a technician or whatever goes down there to service the HVAC, they always say, man, you're never going to be able to sell this house. You have to cut that wall out and take it with you, There are some things that are just worth something, And you can imagine that if you're going to sell everything, right, even if you gain what's more valuable, even if it's intelligent to do that, there is going to be some feelings of loss, right? It may even be imagined loss. I mean, we can talk about the significance of the loss or whatever, right? We can talk about those kind of things. But the bottom line is whether it's real or imagined, it's going to feel like loss sometimes. It's going to feel like loss, right? So what do you think he means when he says, the kingdom of heaven is like this? Yeah, there's going to be emotion in this. In other words, listen, the kingdom of heaven is like this in the sense that it is more valuable. If you sold everything that you had in order to invest in the kingdom of heaven, right? That would be worth it. That would be worth it, okay? However, it may not feel that way. Like there might be a feeling of loss. What the point of this is just this, that when you're fighting the fight of faith, when you're running after things that are of eternal significance, okay? It might not always feel good. So, for example, Daniel was fighting the fight of faith, and where does he find himself? In the lion's den, In other words, your level of comfort, your level of security, may be diminished in this way. There may be feelings that are somewhat negative. Now, I think the truth is there are going to be mixed feelings. I think there's going to be excitement. I think there's going to be the feeling of loss. There's going to be those kinds of things if you decide to pursue the kingdom of heaven. All right? Now, continuing this thought, there was a fourth passage on your page, all right? And at the very beginning of the week, we did 3 passages. Now we're going to look at the fourth one. It was in Corinthians. You might want to just turn there in your Bible because although I put chapter 9 on your page, we're going to start in 9. We're going to go ahead and build into chapter 10. So 1 Corinthians 9:24, which you've read this week, it says, do you not know that in the race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. What's it mean when he says, man, I beat my body and I make it my slave, or I don't run like someone running aimlessly? What's he trying to say? Surrender, okay. Yeah.
He's not taking it lightly.
It's not something he takes lightly, okay. Discipline, yeah. Somebody else said something. What'd you say? Purpose and participation, right? All of these things are true, right? I mean, there's a clear sense of intentionality in what Paul's saying, right? He's like, listen, when you run in such ways as to win the prize. I beat my body and I make it my slave, I don't run like one who runs aimlessly, okay? Now think about this. What you see before you is a 44-year-old body. This is a 44-year-old body. Do you think that this body can run a marathon? How many of you think this body can run a marathon? Okay, there's like 4 that have confidence in that. Thanks for that. Oh, good. Thank you. Okay. How many think that I can't run a marathon? Oh, man, there's only like 4 or 5 that think I can. Okay, that's good.
With the proper training.
Okay, there you go. The answer is actually going to be yes and no, okay? On the yes front, I have a friend who had a motorcycle accident, in his 60s, the early 60s, whatever, and he just thought, man, I got to get back, and he disciplined himself, worked hard, and he actually ran a marathon, after a pretty bad accident, turned around and ran a marathon. I mean, obviously years later, kind of thing, but did that. He accomplished that. So I think that this body can do it. However, I know something about me, and that is that I think that if I were to take off running right now, okay, and just run as long as I can, I think I would be able to run about a quarter mile. You know, I think I could. It might only be an eighth of a mile, but I think I could get the full quarter mile. Now, the reason for this is because, I was a soccer player in high school, and, you got to run when you're a soccer player, so I was in pretty good shape. Then I got married, and then I went to Cedarville. After Bible school, we went to Cedarville. They had this class called Physical Activity in the Christian Life, PACL, So you had to take PACL, like, what in the world? Who comes up with this stuff, But part of that was you had to run this 5K at the end, At that point, I was still a young guy, I was like 22 or so, I hadn't run since high school, but, okay, still hanging in there. And I did that. I completed that 5K, A few years passed, and we get to the time where I'm a soccer coach, right? And we would make those guys run Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, 2 miles. 8 loops around the track, 2 miles, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, right? And I thought, when I was watching those guys run, I was thinking, man, I ought to run with those guys, That'd be good. I'd just get back in shape. I ought to run with those guys. But I was smart enough, all right? I was smart enough not to do it where they were there, okay? Instead, I got to practice early one day, and I thought, I'm going to give this a try. And I ran a quarter mile and about died, right? I thought, oh my gosh, I am glad that these guys were not here to see me. And that's the last time I ran. That's about 22 years ago. That's the last time I've run. You know what? I hate to run. I don't understand you people that like to run. What in the world is wrong with you? I mean, sometimes I say, what, you like to run. What do you like? Oh man, I love how I feel afterwards. I don't feel good afterwards. I feel like I just ran, and I hate to run, And so I don't understand that at all. Now, I know that some people like it. I'm glad for you. Thank you. I'm glad that you can do that. But I can't. But listen, if I were going to, this is what would happen. First, I would have to come up with a plan. I don't even know what the plan would be, but I'd have to come up with a plan. I'd need to do some research. I need to find out what are the distances that I should be running each day and what kinds of runs should I be doing, right? I should know how long I should be doing those. If I'm actually going to train for a marathon, I need to know how long. I mean, really, off the top of my head, I don't know. Is that a 6-month thing? Is that a year thing? Is that a year and a half thing? Is that a 2-year thing? What will it take to get me there, right? I'm going to have to do all of that research. That's actually going to be the easy part, That's actually going to be the easy part because the next thing is going to be I'm going to have to get up every morning and do that. And you know what every morning I'm going to do? I'm going to find every excuse not to do it. I will. I know this, I will get up and it'll be like, I'm not feeling, I didn't sleep so well. I got a lot to do. Every excuse in the book, I'm going to come up with not to do it. But if I actually force myself to go through that, right? If I actually say, no, I'm doing it, and I actually force myself to go through that, I would eventually be able to run a marathon. But for me, it would be more about a mental game than it would be about the actual running thing. For me, it would be just about disciplining my mind and saying, no, this is what we're going to do today, and every day for the year, a year and a half, or whatever. And so Paul is using this analogy. He's saying, run in such a way as to get a prize. I beat my body and I make it my slave. I don't run like one who runs aimlessly. I don't box like somebody beating the air. I bring intentionality. What's he bringing intentionality to? Believing the truths, right? Fighting the fight of faith. Now why, Paul? Why do you need to have that level of intentionality? Look at chapter 10, verse 1. What's the first word in chapter 10, verse 1? For. Whenever you see the word for, you should think since or because, okay? For, since, or because. In other words, chapter 10 is explaining what he's talking about in chapter 9. Chapter 9, I beat my body, I make my slave, I bring intentionality in my walk of faith. Why do you do that? Because I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, that they all passed through the sea, they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, they all ate the same spiritual food, and drank the same spiritual drink. They drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. In other words, listen, if you think about my forefathers, Paul says, they had every advantage. If there was anybody who was going to believe the truths of God's word, it was my forefathers. I mean, imagine, they came through the sea, right? They ate the manna. They drank from the rock. They followed Christ. He's talking about the cloud and all that, right? They followed Christ through the wilderness, And he says, this is the way my people were. If anybody was going to believe, if anybody was going to embrace the truth, it would have been these people, right? Verse 5, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Do you remember what happened? They're marching towards the promised land. They're about 6 months in. God has told them a truth. That land is your land. Go in and get it. He has displayed his power throughout the last 6 months as he's led them through the wilderness, as he parted the Red Sea, as he's provided food and water and those kinds of things, right? 6 months they've been hiking. They finally get to the promised land. They've got the promise. We even call it the promised land, right? I mean, it is something that God has given them. They know the truth, right? 12 spies go in. As they come back, all right, 10 of the spies say, there's no way. I mean, we're talking walls up to the heavens. I mean, we're talking giants. You know, there is no way. Caleb and Joshua, they say, you know what? It's true. There are giants, right? There are giants. There are walls. But God said, this is our land. Let's go in and get it, right? They stood by faith on that promise, and they tried to encourage the nation. But you know what happened? The 10 persuaded the nation, so that the rest ended up wandering for 40 years. Now, the entire nation. Only Joshua and Caleb went into the land out of that generation. Only Joshua and Caleb. You know what? Commentators estimate that there were 2 million people. We know for sure there were 600,000 men. Right? Women and children, don't know. But 600,000 men. If you just stick with the 600,000, forget everybody else of that generation. Just go with 600,000. Only 2 inherited the promise. That's 1 out of every 300,000. Paul saying, listen, I beat my body and I make it my slave. Because if anybody was going to inherit the promises, it would have been my forefathers. And yet as I look at it, only 1 out of 300,000 went in to possess the land. You want to talk about the difficulty of running a marathon? To fight the fight of faith, he's saying this takes intentionality. Right? Intentionality to believe the truths. Not intentionality to be better, intentionality to believe the truths of God's word. Right? Say, man, if only 1 out of every 300,000 went in, what happened? I mean, is there any tips you can give us, Paul? What happened? Look at verse 6. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ as some of them did and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. What's the common theme in verse 6 and verse 11? These things happen as examples. Remember yesterday we talked about that whole idea of bookending, okay? Bookending says, hey, pay attention to what's going on here, right? He's repeated himself from 6, he repeats himself down in 11, okay? And he gives us 4 things. 4 things to watch out for. 4 things that become those examples. The things that happen as examples. It's obvious the way to identify them because you've got, like, for example, in verse 7, idolaters, as some of them were. Sexual immorality, as some of them did. Test Christ, as some of them did. Grumble, as some of them did. So it follows this pattern so that we can identify those 4 things that he wants to talk about. And he gives us enough of the verse, okay, enough of the context in order to tell where was this story. Like, what are we actually talking about here when he says don't grumble, for example, right? And so if you start to work through these, what you find is the first one says, and don't be idolaters as some of them were, right? And this is a phrase that comes from Exodus 32, at the time where they did the golden calf. You know, it's really an extreme, almost shocking scene when you think about this, because here's this pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, right? And they decide, in the middle of all of that, let's go ahead and make a cow out of gold and say that this is the God that brought us out of Egypt, right? I mean, God has parted the Red Sea. He's done all this stuff. This is the God that brought us out of Egypt. And you say, man, I would never be that stupid, you know? I think that says, hey, maybe we don't know ourselves. We sing a song like, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. I mean, we tend to be drifters in this way, right? And so the first thing here is this idea of don't commit idolatry, but think about what idolatry really is. Okay? Idolatry is giving value, giving worth to anything that doesn't merit that value or worth. Right? God necessarily is the one who is worthy of honor, who is worthy of glory, right? Why? Because he's the most valuable being in all of the universe, okay? So if you ascribe worth or glory, okay, to something that is less valuable than him, right, that would be idolatry. That would actually be a lie. You'd be saying, hey, this is worth more than him, right? Now, when you think about our lives, you say, man, how much in my life do I consider worth more than the Lord? You know? Am I maybe guilty of this too? In other words, for them, what really happened is something else was more valuable than God. And the question is, in our lives, is something else more valuable than God? Could those things even be good things? You know? Is my family more valuable than God? Is my wife more valuable than God? Are my kids more valuable than God? Is my reputation more valuable than God? Right? What is it in my life? Is my job more valuable than God? What is it in my life that I would say, yeah, that's more valuable than God? And all you got to do is start to say, where are my priorities? And you'll start to say, okay, you know, everything falls underneath his dominion. This doesn't mean that we don't value our wives or our children or our families or anything like that. What it means is that we value them in the way that he would value them, right? It's in connection to him. In other words, we value them as an act of worship to him, not as ends in themselves, right? And so the very first thing that we see here is that something else is more valuable than God. I beat my body and I make it my slave. Why? Because it's so easy to miss out. In fact, only 1 out of 300,000 were able to grab hold of the promise. Oh man, what can we do? Well, the first thing is, watch out for valuing other things more than God, even if those things are good things. I think there's another thing that he mentions here. It's this idea of sexual immorality. Sexual immorality. The context there is the story of Balaam. Do you remember the story of Balaam? Balaam's the guy that's got the talking donkey. Balaam was a sorcerer, basically. Okay? And so he is called by the king of Moab, whose name was Balak. Okay? He's called to curse the people. So the king of Balak says to Balaam, hey, I want you to come and I want you to curse the nation of Israel. So Balaam is riding his donkey along, angel in the road, and he starts beating the donkey and all that kind of stuff. Donkey turns around and starts talking to him, you know. And Balaam begins to talk back to the donkey, whatever that is, you know. And then he basically gets this message, you cannot do anything that I don't tell you to do, and I'm going to tell you to bless the people. You cannot curse them, you got to bless them. You got to do what I tell you to do. Balaam's like, okay. So he goes up there. Balak's like, okay, curse the people. He says, let me find out what God says. So he goes. God says, no, you got to bless the people. Balaam goes out there. He blesses the people. Balak says, what the heck, dude? I'm paying you to curse the people. You turn around and bless the people. Balaam, who is dumb enough to talk to a donkey, but intelligent enough as a businessman, he actually says this. Here's what we'll do. You pay me a second time. Go ahead and pay me a second time. I'll go ask God, and we'll see what he says. Whatever he says, though, I got to say. And Balak agrees to that and actually pays him a second time. Balaam goes over here. God, what do you want me to do? God says, bless him. He goes out there and blesses him. The story abruptly ends there. All right? All of a sudden, just boom, we've stopped with that narrative and we pick up with another narrative. The story that kind of continues on at this point is there are Moabite women in the camp of Israel. There's sexual immorality, and they're worshiping the idols of Moab. That's the next thing. Then the story kind of picks up again, and we get sort of the Paul Harvey rest of the story thing, right? The rest of the story is summarized. I think the best summary is actually in Revelation, where it says, and do not be like Balaam, who taught Balak how to entice the Israelites. And so we get sort of the rest of the picture. You can imagine, there he is up on the mountain. He blesses the people for the second time, right? Balak's a king. You know? I mean, I just picture him. He's standing there with his sword, right? And this guy just swindled him out of twice. And he's blessed the people. I can imagine Balak's reaching for his sword, right? And you can imagine that Balaam is going, whoa, whoa, whoa. I got an idea. Here's what you do. Okay? What you do is, you send your women in there, all right? And you get them to engage the Israelites in the worship of your gods. You see, God is a God who's a jealous God. This God, their God, is a jealous God. So what you do is you basically turn the people against their God, right? So that their God rejects them. Now they'll be embracing your gods, and you won't have to worry. Their God's not going to defend them. Now, Balaam's error, which is also mentioned in Revelation, is this idea that God was accepting Israel on the basis of Israel at all. God was their God because of his word, not because of their behavior, right? So he misunderstood that. But nevertheless, we're told that he taught Balak how to entice the Israelites. And what we get is this sense, because of, I think, the abruptness of the narrative there, we get the sense in which the Israelites just wanted what they wanted. You know, they had unchecked desires, right? I mean, we go from Balaam up on the mountain, blessing them. Next scene, they're messing around down there. You know? Why? Unchecked desires. I think that's the second question. That's the second thing that we're watching out for. Not only are we saying, do we value other things more than God, but we're also saying, man, do I have unchecked desires? Are there just things that I just don't even think about? You know, I mean, everything that I have, I'm a steward of. I would see God as the owner of everything that I have. Therefore, I should be thoughtful about the way that I handle it, right? Just like if you're managing a business, you should be thoughtful about everything as you manage that business. Do I have unchecked desires? Do I want what I want? Right? That's the second thing. The third thing that he says there is this idea that they tested Christ, right? They tested Christ. And we get enough of the story to find out that this was that time where they rejected the manna. They rejected the manna. And again, I mean, I can identify with the Israelites on this one, you know. I mean, you eat manna every day for 40 years or whatever. Man, that'd be not so good, you know. But this was God's provision. They're in the wilderness. If God doesn't provide, they die. This was God's provision, and they complained against God's provision. To put that in context, if you're a parent, have you ever given your kid a gift, and your kid was like, I don't want that, that's stupid, or something like that? Did your kid ever do that? You went from very generous to very angry in just a split second. Well, you're going to be thankful, young man, you know. That's, you know, I mean, you get upset. If they reject your provision, it doesn't matter if they don't like it. They need to be thankful, you know. I'm going to teach you how to be thankful. I mean, that's what we would do. And so they're rejecting God's provision. This is God's gift, you know, and they reject it. The question is, do we ever reject God's provision? I think, you know, as we as missionaries do, you know, God's provision it's easy for it not to be enough. It's easy to complain against God's provision. You know, man, if we just get one more classroom, we just get the camp done, just get the building, just get the one more thing, you know? We had a specific thing that always comes to my mind when I was thinking through this. The example that came to my mind was we used to own a safari truck. It was awesome, right? It was awesome. It really was. Okay? It was a flatbed truck that we bought, and we put bench seats down the sides, all right? And then we put this thing over top of it, this roof over top of it. It had like these roll-down things, you know, so when it rains, you tie that down or whatever, you know? And the deal is at that point in the ministry, we didn't have a whole lot of money. We didn't have the ability to just like, let's just ship a bus down or anything like that. And we needed a vehicle. We were beginning to pick up teams. We were beginning to move kids around. When we first started moving kids around, we just used our personal cars. Just shoved like 20 kids in a car, you know, and drive them to the next building. You know, that's what we were doing. But we needed this. We needed this. It was a bus. It was our school bus. That's what it was primarily. We also used to go get teams. And it was the right vehicle for the right time. I'm convinced of it because it didn't cost us very much in mechanical, and it wasn't a very expensive vehicle comparatively to actually buy and outfit that way. And so it was a good vehicle. It was the right vehicle for the right time. I believe that. Teams loved that vehicle. I mean, it was like you get picked up at the airport, you get picked up at the airport in a safari truck, you know? I mean, that adds a whole nother level of excitement, you know? And then it got to the place where we had some other vehicles, and we were like, we didn't use the safari truck to pick people up at the airport, you know? And so they would get to campus, they'd see that safari truck, they'd be like, hey, can we take a ride in the safari truck? Of course, you know, then you're driving them out there, you know, in the safari truck, whatever, in order to go to the villages, go to the Batage, took a safari truck. Do you know who didn't like safari truck? Missionaries. Missionaries did not like safari truck. I'm including myself in this. I'm going to tell you the story. You know, I'll tell you why we didn't like the safari truck. Hey, if you're here for 1 week, fantastic. You know, everything is awesome. Gold showers, no problem. 1 week, no big deal, right? Safari truck, fine. But you know what? This is what our safari truck journey looked like. We would leave our apartments in town at 6:10 in the morning. Okay? It would take us about an hour and 15 minutes to drive out to Lima, where we would set up the school. Okay? It was freezing in the morning because the sun was down and you're whipping down the road at about 50 miles an hour, right? Bouncing all over the place in the back of this thing, half asleep but nailing your head against the pole and whatever else there is, And we only have 2 seasons here in the Dominican. We have rainy season, we have dry season. So if it's dry season, you're flying down through there, completely freezing until you hit the dirt roads. Then they're slow and bouncy, but you're covered with dust, right? So you get there and you're like wiping yourself off. You're like, man, what the heck, trying to get that off. Then you set up the school. Then you tear down the school at the end of the day. Now you're covered in a layer of sweat. Of course, you get back on the truck and you ride it back home. Now you're covered in a layer of sweat and dirt, right, and dust, and then so it's just nasty, right? That was 6 months of our year. Then along would come rainy season, And in rainy season, you'd be driving down through there, and all of a sudden, downpour, And so you'd be like, shut the flaps, And down would come the flaps. You'd tie those things off. But the back of the bus acted like a suction, right? Like it acted like a vacuum. So you'd be going down there with all those things down, and the exhaust is getting sucked into the back of the bus. So you're like, shut the flaps. And you're like, open the flaps! Because you're dying on this exhaustion, right? Or on the exhaust. Well, it got to the point where the flaps eventually just blew off. They just ripped off the side. So that settled that. There was no option to drop the flaps. So now when it rained, it just poured down raining. It'd be pouring in on both sides. I remember one time very distinctly pulling into town. There's some of those memories that just get engraved in your mind. You just think about them. There was a moment there where we're pulling into town. I can remember the curve where we were. It was dumping down rain, both sides of this vehicle, which meant that all of us, which at that point was just the missionaries, there's probably about 8 of us there in the back of that truck. We are standing up in the middle of the truck, right? The bed seats are running down both sides. We're kind of doing this surfing thing down the road, right, as he's going like this. Rain pouring in from here, rain pouring in from here, drenched from here down, damp from here up, right? We've got all of the bags and stuff because we had to set up school each day. We had to tear down school each day. So we got all of the bags. So we grabbed the bags because they're getting drenched. There's water all over the floor. So we got the bags. We're holding them up above our heads. So here we are, running down the road like this, completely soaked, bags above our head. And I just remember distinctly thinking, this is my life. Like, what happened? Where did I go wrong? Just grumbling. It's funny now. It wasn't so funny then, just grumbling, just complaining about the Lord's provision, Last year, we sold that truck, that's fantastic. I'm so glad about that. But it's kind of a piece of a piece of freedom history, an icon or something. I don't know. But I told the board I sold that truck, and they're like, "You sold the truck? You should have put it on the playground." I'm like, "No, we don't want that truck anymore." Just complaining about the truck. Right? It's easy to do that. It's easy to look at God's provisions. What you have right now is God's provision. If you believe what the Bible says, what you have right now is God's provision. It's yours to steward, And there's an opportunity to be thankful about that, or there's an opportunity to complain about that. And he's saying, man, one of the things that I beat my body and I make it my slave is I don't want to complain against the Lord's provision. I don't want to value something else above the Lord, right? I don't want to just want what I want, and I don't want to complain against the Lord's provision. And he gives us one more thing. The fourth thing that he gives us there is this grumbling, all right? Grumbling, okay? And the grumbling is the situation where Korah rebelled. So the idea here is that they were grumbling against the leadership. I don't know if you remember this rebellion, but Korah actually rebels against the leadership there. All right, and so what happens is that God actually opens up a hole underneath Korah's tent, and he and his family all go down into the earth alive, it says, and then God closed the earth back over top of them. Okay? That's what happened. And do you know what the Israelites did when they saw that happen? They grumbled against the leadership. They went and they say to Moses and Aaron, what you did was too harsh, as if Moses and Aaron have the ability to open up a hole underneath somebody's tent and then close it back up over top of them. And God then sent the destroying angel and killed 14,000 of them. This was a bad one, right? As they grumbled against leadership, God says to them, "Listen, here's what you're going to do. You're all going to bring, each tribal leader or whatever is going to bring a staff, okay? And whatever staff buds, that's going to be the one who is the leader, right? And so they all bring their staff, and Aaron's staff buds, and not only does it bud, it says it actually produces walnuts." Right? Or almonds. Yeah, it actually produces almonds, And so Aaron is the clear leader. Moses and Aaron are the clear leaders, right? And but this grumbling against the leadership. I mean, do we ever find ourselves grumbling against the leadership? Whoever it is that's your leadership, do you ever grumble against the leadership? If you say, well, not really. I think most of you, I can probably settle this with one word. Politics, right? Do you ever grumble against the leadership? You know what the Bible says? The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. We're told twice in chapter 14 of Romans, there is no authority that exists except that which has been established by God. We're told in Timothy to pray for our leaders. He's talking about political leaders because he says so that you can live peaceful lives. That was written during the time that Nero was emperor of Rome, right? This is the perspective of faith, right? Now, I'm not saying, listen, in our country, we have the ability to vote, we have the ability to do those kind of things, but there are times when the exercises of our rights then turns into grumbling against the leadership. That's where we're saying, hey, be careful. Be careful, you know? I think that what's happening when we do that is we get our residency ahead of our citizenship, right? We are citizens of heaven. You know, we reside here. That's true. But let's be honest, you know, I mean, not any kingdom has ever lasted forever, you know? I mean, the Roman civilization, the Greek civilization, England, I mean, whatever. You know, they don't stay world powers forever, you know? I don't know that that even happened during our lifetime, but it's not worth grumbling against what God is doing, right? If we believe those truths. We would grumble when we don't believe those truths, right? You see how this is fighting the fight of faith, okay? Coming back over and believing the truths. This means, man, participate in the political process. You know, my oldest wants to be a political commentator, you know? I mean, great, go do it, you know? But be careful the way that's done, you know, so that we're not grumbling against the leadership, right? And so these are the four things that he says, hey, listen, I beat my body and I make it my slave. Why, Paul? Because only 1 out of 300,000 men went in to inherit that land, the promised land. They knew the promise, and yet only 1 out of 300,000 actually took hold of it. And I want to take hold of what Christ has taken hold of for me. So these things are written for your examples. What things, Paul? The idea that you've got to check. What are you valuing more than God? Are your desires unchecked? Do you complain against God's provision? Do you grumble against the leadership? Right? These are the 4 pitfalls that Paul identifies as we try to run this race. Does that make sense to you, that part? Okay? So then the thought then is this, is if you want to fight the fight of faith, all right? If you want to fight the fight of faith, the thought here then is that it's going to take some intentionality. All right? It's going to take some intentionality. You're going to have to beat your body and make it your slave. You're going to have to be disciplined. Again, this discipline is pointed towards believing the truth, not pointed towards doing certain things or something like that, right? It's pointed towards believing the truth. But how do you do that? How do you fight the fight of faith with discipline? How do you fight the fight of faith with intentionality? This is what you do. You bring it down to a very easy level, right? Too many times you say fight the fight of faith, and it's this ethereal concept that I think I'm fighting the fight of faith. I don't know if I'm fighting the faith. Here's an easy way to think about this. What are you struggling with right now? What's going on in your life right now? What transitions are happening in your life right now? Then ask yourself this question. How would I fight the fight of faith in that area? How would I fight the fight of faith in that area? See, that will give you something specific, you know? So Pam and I went through a transition here recently, right? Our kids are now in the U.S., our 2 oldest in the U.S. And we thought about this several years ago. We thought about this, okay? And we asked ourselves, what does it look like to stand on this truth? In other words, how does fighting the fight of faith affect our parenting at this level in our context? And one of the things that we decided to stand on was this idea that our children are not ours, they're the Lord's, right? He's their owner, okay? And so what we had to do then is we had to say, okay, we've got to be intentional about the way that we treat our kids. Number 1, we're going to be careful about the way we direct them. You know what would be fantastic for my kids to do? Become missionaries to the Dominican Republic. That'd be great, you know, if they were become missionaries to the Dominican Republic. But you know what? We don't try to steer them that way. We're not trying to steer them against that either, you know, but we're very careful and intentional to call out their gifts and abilities that we're seeing so that they don't end up living out our expectations in their life, but that they're set free to walk with the Lord in whatever way He calls them. Another thing that we thought that we needed to do in our context was we needed to send them home at times. So in 10th grade, we sent them home for 3 months, right? In order that they could work, save money for college, that kind of thing. Also, because we knew we had to prepare our hearts. Last year, we sent them home for 5 months. This year, we sent them home at the end of February, and they'll be there. Well, we won't see them again until Christmas, right? And that's the way that it will be for us here. It's a little different. They're not going to come home, for a weekend or whatever. They're not going to have that ability. And so they're going to come home at Christmas. And so we knew we needed to prepare our hearts for that. And so we began to make those kinds of decisions as we walk with the Lord. But we needed to think about that before we ever got to it, because if we'd have gotten to it before we thought about it, we wouldn't have done it in the way that we think the Lord would have had us steward that situation, right? But you can do the same thing in whatever it is that the Lord is taking you through. What does it look like to fight the fight of faith when it comes to finances? What does it look like to fight the fight of faith when it comes to entertainment? What does it look like to fight the fight of faith when it comes to who I choose to date? What's it look like to fight the fight of faith when we're talking about my friendships? What does it look like to fight the fight of faith in my marriage? What does it look like to fight the fight of faith in my view of hardship? What does it look like to fight the fight of faith in my view of the meaning of life? What does it look like to fight the fight of faith in my view of myself? Whatever it is that you're struggling with right now, whatever transition, whatever those things are that occupy your mind, your question is, what does it look like to fight the fight of faith in this way, right? And then you identify those truths, right? You go to Scripture and you say, man, these are some truths that directly affect this area. And then you begin to fight the fight of faith, right? It's just like that runner. You got to identify what am I even going to do here, right? And then you go back and you say, okay, so it means dig into God's Word, right? In a way that leads you to the place where you can believe His promises in the areas that He's brought about in your life. Does this make sense to you? All right? So it does need intentionality. That's what we're seeing here. It takes intentionality. It takes discipline. But this kind of a thing can provide the foundation. You can come up with your own areas, but one of the things that if you say, man, I'm going to do this, the thing that you've got to do is provide your own intentionality. Nobody can provide you intentionality. That's the thing. A lot of times, we can listen to a message. It's very easy. Listen to a message. That's a good message. Walk away. Forget the whole thing, right? I can't give you intentionality. You can't give me intentionality. There are some of you out there that it probably kills you that I don't run, And you're like, man, I wish that guy would run, I don't know. And it's just like, man, but you cannot give me intentionality. You can tell me all you want, and I will let it go through one ear and out the other, right? But this is what it looks like to fight the fight of faith. But once again, although I've said this several times, the intentionality that we are talking about is the intentionality to believe the truths of God's Word. That's the intentionality that we're talking about.